Ethan Cowboy tore the telegram in half the morning she was supposed to arrive, and stood there in the cold kitchen, both pieces in his fist, and told himself he'd made a mistake the moment he'd sent it. A wife. He'd asked for a wife like a man orders fence, practical, necessary, nothing more. Now she was on the stage from Laramie, and he had no way to stop it, and no good reason to want to. He threw the pieces in the fire, watched them burn, and told himself it didn't matter what she was like, because he'd already decided nothing was going to change. He had no idea how wrong a man could be. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara and Ethan all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Ethan knew, because he'd checked his pocket watch 3 times and put it away twice, and finally left it in his vest pocket, with his thumb pressed against the case, just to have something to do with his hands. He was standing outside Holt's Mercantile when it rolled in, not at the stage stop where a man waiting for his mail-order bride ought to be standing. He'd told himself he was there for feed prices. He wasn't. He just couldn't make himself stand at that stop like a man on an auction block, waiting to see what he'd bought. Coach door opened. A woman stepped down. She didn't wait for the driver's hand. Didn't look around the street with the wide-eyed uncertainty he'd been bracing for. She stepped down, set her satchel at her feet, and looked at Bitter Creek, Wyoming, the way you look at a problem you've already decided you can solve. Plain brown traveling dress, dark hair pinned back without fuss. A face that wasn't pretty the way paintings were pretty, but was the kind of face that made you look twice because something in it refused to be dismissed. Ethan crossed the street before he'd made a conscious decision to do it. Miss Whitmore. She turned, looked at him with eyes that were a clear direct gray and gave nothing away. Mr. Calloway. He picked up her trunk without asking. Started walking toward the wagon. She followed without being told. They drove the 6 miles to the ranch, without a word passing between them, and Ethan spent those 6 miles looking at the road and feeling the particular discomfort of a man who has prepared himself for one thing and received something else entirely. He'd prepared for fragile. She wasn't fragile. He'd prepared for desperate. She didn't look desperate either. What she looked like was a woman who had made a decision and intended to live with it. No apology in her posture, no performance of gratitude. Just a woman sitting straight on a wagon bench in November wind, watching his land go by with serious eyes. It unsettled him in a way he didn't have a name for yet. He showed her the house in 7 sentences. Kitchen, lard room, hands eat at 6, I eat at 6:30. Water barrels are around back. Ask Tom if you need anything heavy moved. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, looked around at everything once, and said, "Where are the household ledgers?" He stopped, under the sideboard. "Why? You said in the telegram I'd be managing household accounts." She moved to the sideboard and crouched down. "I'd like to start today." He watched her pull out the wooden box he hadn't opened in 4 months. Watched her set it on the table, sits down and open the first ledger with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this their whole life. "Lamps on the shelf," he said, for lack of anything else. "I see it. Thank you." He stood there another moment. She was already reading. He put on his hat and went back outside and stood in the cold for a full minute trying to locate the source of the strange feeling in his chest. Couldn't locate it, so he went to work. She had the kitchen reorganized by the time he came in for supper. Not rearranged for aesthetics, reorganized for efficiency. Things used daily within reach, the things used weekly on the second shelf. Yarder inventoried and a short list set on the table in a handwriting that was small and precise and entirely serious. Salt, coffee, lamp oil, dried beans, replace before end of week flour. Check, the second water barrel has a slow seep at the lower seam. Ethan read the list. Read it again. "You found the barrel seam," he said. "It's not bad yet, but it will be." She set a plate in front of him. "I can show Tom tomorrow if you'd rather he handle it." Full. biscuits, salt pork, roasted root vegetables. Nah, nothing elaborate, but it was hot and it was done right, and Ethan, who had been eating his own indifferent cooking for the better part of 11 years, noticed the difference in the first bite and said nothing about it because he was not about to give a woman he'd known 6 hours the satisfaction of a compliment. 8. She sat across from him with her own plate and ate too, without attempting conversation, which he appreciated more than he expected. Halfway through the meal he said, "The barrel seam. Did you spot it? Watermark on the ground underneath. Fresh." She reached for her coffee. "Also, the wood at the base is darker than the rest." "It's been seeping a while." Ethan set down his fork. "Tom been looking at that barrel for a month." Tom was probably looking at the top of the barrel. She ate a bite of biscuit. "Leaks don't announce themselves from the top." He looked at her across the table. She looked back and waited to see if he was going to say something about it. He picked up his fork again. "I'll have Tom patch it tomorrow," he said. "Good." She went back to her food. That was the end of the conversation. But something had shifted in the air of the kitchen, some small and unquantifiable thing, and Ethan felt it even if he had no intention of examining what it was. A ledger revelation came on the 4th day. He came in from evening rounds to find her at the kitchen table with every ledger spread out, the lamp pulled close, and an expression on her face he'd come to recognize in 4 days, the one that meant she'd found something, and was deciding how to say it. She said. He sat down, because the tone in her voice left no reasonable alternative. "Your grain supplier has been billing you twice for the same shipments," she said, and turned a ledger to face him. Finger moved down a column of figures. March, April, June, each time 2 entries 3 days apart, nearly identical amounts. Different invoice numbers, but the same quantities. Ethan looked at the figures. Nobody caught that. Nobody was looking. She pulled a second ledger forward. "That's not all. Whoever did your tallying last spring carried a wrong figure from February into March, and the error compounded through the whole quarter." She set a piece of paper in front of him. A final number was written at the bottom in her small, precise hand. $64.30. Ethan stared at it. "That's gone," he said. "That's what you've lost to errors and double billing in 1 year." She folded her hands on the table. "I've already written corrected figures through October. I'll have November done by Friday. And I'd like to write to your grain supplier, if you'll allow it." Me. Write to him. The letter may not be. She paused, choosing words with the care of someone who had learned that directness in a woman made certain men defensive. "It will be direct." "Good." He looked up from the paper. Something crossed her face. Not quite surprise. More like relief carefully disguised. "I'll have the letter ready tomorrow." He looked at the $64.30 again. And at her. "How long would it have taken me to find this?" She considered it honestly. "You might not have." He nodded. "Once. The way a man nods when he's accepting information he doesn't enjoy but recognizes as true." "Thank you," he said. She closed the ledger. "Get some sleep," she said. "It says tomorrow's going to be cold." He went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about $64.30 and a woman who had found it in 4 days. And something else. Something he was keeping very at a distance, which was the fact that no one had ever across from at that table and said, "Sit down," like they had a right to be there. And he hadn't minded it. That was the part he couldn't account for. The town had made up its mind about Clara Whitmore before the end of her first week. He heard it from Billy Marsh, who was young enough to be tactless and honest enough to report things accurately. "Oaks in town are saying she's desperate, boss. Saying only a woman with nothing going for her answers a telegram like yours." "Mrs. Renner, Mrs. Aldridge." Billy paused. "Some others." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, and he kept his hands on the leather and his eyes on the task. "What did you say?" he asked. "Sir?" "When they said it, what did you say back?" Billy straightened up. "I said she fixed the water barrel and reorganized the larder and is doing the ledgers, and the place runs better already." He paused. Mrs. Renner said, "That proves she had nowhere else to go." Ethan finished with the cinch, put his foot in the stirrup, mounted. "Next time Mrs. Renner has an opinion about my household," he said, "you can tell her I don't recall asking." He rode out. Billy watched him go with the expressions of someone storing that sentence away for future use. Clara heard the town's opinion for herself on Saturday. She was in the mercantile in the canned goods aisle when two women's voices came around the shelf from the other side. Clear as water, unhurried. The way people speak when they've forgotten or don't care that walls are thin and aisles are short. Plain, isn't she? Well, he didn't exactly advertise for beauty. Still, a woman with any prospects doesn't answer a telegram like that. Father was a drinker, I heard. Laramie. Whole family was a small particular pause, the kind that speaks volumes well. You know, Clara picked up a tin of coffee, set it in her basket. Up a second tin, set it in her basket. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She had a great deal of practice at this particular skill, keeping her exterior still while the interior did whatever it needed to do. She went to the counter and paid. Outside she loaded the wagon. Then she sat on the bench and let herself have exactly 30 seconds. 30 seconds to feel it, the old familiar sting of being found insufficient by people who had not taken 30 minutes to learn her name. 30 seconds to let it be what it was, which was painful and unfair, and also completely irrelevant to who she actually was. Then she picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch. 30 seconds was what she allowed it, not one more. That evening she asked him the question she'd been holding since the first day. He was at the table with his coffee and the corrected ledgers, going over the figures she'd prepared. She sat down across from him without asking. "Why a mail-order arrangement?" she said. He looked up. "There must have been women in Bitter Creek willing to marry you," she said. "You're not an impossible man." He considered that for a moment. Like he was deciding how honest to be. "There were women willing," he said finally. "That wasn't the problem." Then what was? He set down the coffee. Both hands flat on the table. The posture of a man choosing words the way a person chooses footing on bad ground, deliberately, one step at a time. "A woman from this town comes with a history in this town," he said. "I've people who've known her all her life. People with opinions." He paused. "My first engagement was to a woman from Bitter Creek. 6 months. She left in March of '79 and married a banker in Denver." Another pause. "Before she left, she made sure everyone within 20 miles knew exactly what she thought of me." The kitchen was very quiet. "What did she think of you?" Clara asked. He looked at her directly, cold, closed off, not capable of what a woman needs. Clara held his gaze without flinching. "Was she right?" The silence went on long enough that it became its own kind of answer. He said, "Back then, Clara was quiet for a moment. You sent that telegram because you wanted someone without roots here. Someone who'd judge you on what she actually saw." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Like she'd named something he hadn't known was nameable. "Yes," he said, "that's not cold. That's just honest." She stood. Knight Ethan, his name. First time she'd used it. She was almost to the hallway when he said her name was Dora Fitch. Clara stopped. "She wasn't wrong about everything," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not telling you the story to make her the villain." Clara stood with her back to him and felt something move in her chest, something she was not ready to examine. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She went to her room. Lay in the dark. Thought about a man who defended the woman who'd hurt him because he believed in being fair even when it cost him something. Understood, for the first time, what she was dealing with. Not coldness, decency. Buried so deep under 11 years of alone that most people would never have looked far enough to find it. She found it on day 7. The storm warning came on a Thursday, carried in by Tom Briggs with the gravity of a man who had read enough Wyoming winters to know the difference between ordinary cold and something with intention behind it. "It's building," he told Ethan at the stable. North guy's wrong." I'd want everything close by tomorrow noon. Ethan looked north. The sky was the color of old pewter. Still, pressurized in a way that had nothing to do with wind. Move the cattle, he said. South pasture, close the north shelter. Tom nodded, started to go, then stopped. Your wife already told Billy to double the firewood and fill the water barrels this morning. Ethan turned. She did, before I came to you. Tom's expression was carefully neutral in the way of a man who is finding something amusing but recognizes that amusement is not his place. I'd mention it. He went to manage the cattle. Ethan stood looking at the north sky for another moment. Then he went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table, writing the letter to the grain supplier. She looked up when he came in. Tom, tell you, he said. I told Tom, she said, or I told Billy and Billy told Tom. I didn't want to overstep. You didn't. She looked at him. You read the sky right, he said. It came out more simply than he'd intended. Thus guarded. I would have come to the same conclusion by noon. You did it at dawn. She looked at him for a moment with those steady gray eyes. Uncle in Minnesota taught me, she said. He said the sky tells you everything if you learn to ask it the right questions. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He almost never sat at the table outside of mealtimes. What else did he teach you? Ethan said. Something in her expression shifted. Small, careful, like a door opening an inch to check the weather before deciding whether to open further. A lot, she said. He was a practical man. Tell me. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her pen. And talked. The snow started Friday evening like it had something to apologize for. Oft, tentative, the kind of snow that made a person think it might amount to nothing. By midnight it had stopped apologizing. Clara got up at 2 o'clock because the sound of the storm had changed, deepened, broadened, taken on the particular pressure weight of serious weather, and went to the kitchen and built up the fire. Ethan was already there, standing at the window with a lamp, looking out at white and dark and nothing else. You should sleep, he said without turning. So should you. She moved to the cook stove. All in by 11. Tom checked the shelter seams this afternoon. Good. She put the coffee on. Not because either of them needed it, but because a pot of coffee at 2 in the morning was the kind of small sanity that made the rest of a situation manageable. He turned from the window, looked at the coffee pot, looked at her, sat down at the table without being asked. She sat across from him. The storm pressed at the windows, the fire popped and settled, and something about the hour and the dark and the weight of weather outside made the usual careful distance between them seem less necessary. You've done this before, he said. Sat a storm out. Minnesota. Storm lasted 4 days. She poured 2 cups. Pushed one toward him. I was 15. My uncle said the only real danger in a long storm wasn't the cold. It was the quiet, the kind that gets into your head. What did he do about it? Kept us talking. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Nothing important, just words in the air. Ed's silence in a storm was the same as letting it win. Ethan looked at his coffee. He sounds like he knew what he was doing. It was the most capable person I've ever known. A pause. The following spring. Fever. She said it simply, without drama, in the way of someone who has finished grieving a thing but hasn't forgotten it. I think about him every time the weather changes. My father was the same way, Ethan said. Not many words. When something needed doing, he knew exactly what it was. He turned the cup in his hands. Died owing the bank nothing. Built this place from 40 acres and a promise. Never told my mother he loved her a single time. Did she know? He was quiet. She said she did, he said finally. Said he showed her every day. He looked at the cup. I used to think she was being generous, making peace with what she had. Now, he looked up at her. Now I think she was smarter than I was, he said. Yeah, and I was the one who missed it. Clara held his gaze and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish the moment, and she had learned that some moments were better left whole. Outside the blizzard howled, inside the fire burned. And Ethan Calloway, who had eaten alone at this table for 11 years, with his coffee and his words, and the woman he had chosen without wanting to, and did not feel alone. He noticed that. He didn't know what to do with it yet. Noticed. The fence went at 3 in the morning. Tom pounded on the back door hard enough to wake the house. Ethan was up and pulling on his coat before Tom finished his second knock. Clara was 3 steps behind him. "East section's down," Tom said, breath coming out in white bursts. "Snowload took 2 posts. The cattle are moving." "Many out. Billy's counting. Could be 6, could be more." Ethan reached for his gloves. "I'm coming," Clara said. Ethan turned. One look, the kind that preceded a sentence starting with "you can't." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't tell me what I can't do in a storm when you need every hand you've got." Her voice was flat and certain. Argumentative, just immovable. "I've worked a fence line. I know how to move cattle in snow. You need 3 people at minimum for this, and you have 2.5. Me." She was already pulling on her heavy coat, the Laramie coat, the one she'd bought specifically for Wyoming winters, because she had not arrived in this territory unprepared for a single thing. So, Tom looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back with those gray eyes and waited. He handed her the extra rope. He said, "Don't get ahead of us." "I won't get ahead of you," she said. "I'll stay exactly where I'm useful." They went out into the blizzard. What happened in the next 2 hours was not heroic, in the way stories made things heroic. It was cold and dark and loud with wind, and the work was brutal and simple, finding cattle in whiteout conditions, moving them without spooking them into scattering further. Working a broken fence line with hands that stopped feeling like hands 20 minutes in. Air didn't speak unless she had to. She watched what was needed and did it. When a heifer broke left, she was already moving right to cut off the angle, before Ethan called the direction. When a post needed holding while Tom drove it, she held it without being asked, boots planted in knee-deep snow, shoulders set. At one point, Ethan looked across the fence line, through the snow and the wind, and saw her rope in hand, body turned into the weather. Not fighting it, but working with it, and felt something knock loose in his chest that he had no good language for. Something that he recognized distantly as the sensation of being wrong about a person. Profoundly, completely wrong. They got the cattle back. Got the fence workable, not perfect, not permanent, but enough to hold until daylight and real repairs. They came back to the ranch house in a tight group, heads down, exhausted in the specific way of cold physical work in the dark. Inside the kitchen, Billy dropped into the nearest chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man reconsidering his career. Tom peeled off his frozen gloves and said nothing, which was how Tom communicated deep feelings. Clara went straight to the stove, built the fire back up, set water to heat, moved around the kitchen with quiet, methodical purpose while the men thawed out and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Ethan stood in the middle of the kitchen, covered in snow, watching her. She turned and found him looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not warmth exactly. Ethan Calloway was not a man who arrived at warmth easily or quickly. But something underneath warmth. Something foundational. Expression of a man revising. "You've worked cattle in a storm before," he said. "Not often," she said. "But yes, you didn't mention that. You didn't ask me much about what I could do." She said it without accusation. Just truth offered plainly. He accepted it the same way. Just nodded. Tom chose this moment to stand and announce he was going to check on the other hands, and Billy remembered an urgent need to be anywhere other than this kitchen, and in 30 seconds it was just the 2 of them. Ethan pulled off his frozen hat, set it on the table. "Clara," he said. She stilled. In 11 days he had said her name twice. Each time it landed differently. This time it landed like something he'd decided. "I have to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I wrote that telegram because the ranch needed running." He said it slowly, finding the words the way you find footing on ice. "I told myself that was sufficient reason. That the arrangement was fair because it was honest." He looked at his hat on the table. "And What I didn't think about, what I didn't ask, was what you needed. What you were walking into, whether it was fair to you. The kitchen was very quiet except for the storm outside and the fire snapping. It was your choice too, she said carefully. It was. But choices made with incomplete information aren't really choices. He looked up. I should have written more in that telegram. I should have told you what this place actually was. How hard the winters come, how alone it gets. He held her gaze. I didn't, because I was afraid you wouldn't come. And I thought I needed what you could provide. Era looked at him across the kitchen. And now, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The question he was working toward was visible in his face, working its way up, through 11 years of careful containment. Through the particular discipline of a man who had decided long ago that wanting things was more dangerous than going without them. Now I'm starting to think, he said slowly, that I had no idea what I actually needed. You didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Clara reached for 2 cups. She sat down. The coffee's ready. He sat. She poured. She set the cup in front of him and sat across from him, and outside the blizzard of 1885, hammered the walls of Callaway Ranch like it was trying to take the whole place apart. It didn't take it apart. The walls held, the fire burned. And 2 people who had come together out of practicality and necessity sat across a kitchen table in the middle of a Wyoming winter night, and felt for the first time the particular and terrifying possibility that they might have stumbled into something neither of them had planned for. Neither of them said so, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers managing an arrangement. Nay, it was the silence of 2 people sitting very still because they were both listening to the same thing. And neither one of them was ready to name what it was. But it was there. It had been there, maybe, since a wagon ride 6 miles from Bitter Creek, when a woman had sat straight-backed in November wind and refused to perform gratitude she didn't feel. And a man had noticed, without wanting to, without knowing what to do about it. Without being able, after 11 days and 1 blizzard and $64.30, to pretend he hadn't. The blizzard broke on the 4th morning, like a man finally letting go of something he'd been holding too long. Clara heard the change before she saw it, the wind dropping from a roar to a moan to nothing, the particular silence that came after serious weather, the kind that felt almost loud after days of noise. She was already at the stove when Ethan came in from the first check of the morning, snow still on his shoulders, face raw from the cold that had followed the storm. He poured his own coffee for the first time since she'd arrived. She noticed that, didn't say anything about it. He sat down at the table, and they drank in the easy quiet that had become, somewhere between the fence and the kite, and 2 in the morning conversations, a different kind of quiet than the one they'd started with. Not the silence of 2 strangers managing distance. Nay. Something closer to 2 people who had run out of reasons to pretend they weren't paying attention to each other. We'll be clear by Thursday, he said. Tom said the same thing. You've been talking to Tom. Tom talks to everyone. It's his greatest gift. She set down her cup. He told me about the Holloway offer. Kitchen changed, not dramatically, not with any visible shift in the air or the light. But Ethan's hands, which had been relaxed around his coffee cup, settled differently on the table. And his face, which had been the most open she'd seen it in 11 days, closed by about half. Ethan said. He didn't mean harm by it. He was explaining why the east fence mattered so much. She looked at him directly. Marcus Holloway offered to buy this ranch. He did. And you said no. I said no. She stopped. How many times has he asked? Something moved across Ethan's face. That was the 3rd time. Clara set both hands flat on the table. The gesture of a woman doing arithmetic in her head that had nothing to do with numbers. Not going to stop asking. No, he's not. Then we need to make sure he has nothing to pressure you with. She pulled the nearest ledger toward her. Which means the accounts need to be clean. The debts need to be visible and manageable, and you need to know exactly where you stand before he comes back. Ethan looked at her. You said we, he said. She looked up. A. He was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that appeared when she did something that didn't fit whatever category he'd originally filed her under. Not surprise exactly, more like a man recalculating. Ed, she said, and went back to the ledger. He was quiet for a moment. Then he'll come by end of the month. He always does after a storm. Checks the ranches that took damage, looking for weak spots. We have 3 weeks, Clara. She looked up again. It's not just the money, he said. Holloway doesn't want this land because it's good land. He wants it because it borders his water access on the north side. If he gets this ranch, he controls the water for 6 other properties in this valley. He paused. Those families have been here longer than he has. Some of them since before Wyoming was a territory. She was quiet for a moment, taking that in. Then it's not just about us, she said. No. She closed the ledger, looked at him steadily. Tell me everything he's said, every time he's come. Everything he offered and everything he threatened. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he started talking. Nah. And for the next hour, he told her things he hadn't told Tom, or Billy, or any of the other men who'd worked his land for years. Not because he'd been keeping secrets, but because no one had ever sat across from him and asked in a way that made it clear they were asking in order to help, not in order to judge. Clara listened without interrupting, and somewhere in that hour, without ceremony or announcement, the arrangement between them became something else. Not a marriage yet in any real sense, but a partnership. And for Ethan Calloway, who had run this ranch alone for 11 years and eaten at a separate table from his own hands, and told himself he preferred it that way, a partnership was more terrifying than any blizzard Wyoming had ever produced. As a blizzard eventually ended. This, he was starting to understand, was only beginning. Marcus Holloway did not wait until the end of the month. He came on a Wednesday, 8 days after the storm broke, riding up the main road on a gray horse that cost more than most families in the valley made in a year. He had 2 men with him, not ranch hands, the kind of men who were paid to stand in a particular way and let their size do most of their communication. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window. She set down the letter she was drafting to the grain supplier, straightened her dress, and went to tell Ethan. She found him at the stable with Tom. Holloway, she said. That was all. Ethan and Tom exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Then Ethan handed Tom the harness he'd been working on and walked toward the main yard. Clara walked with him. He glanced at her sideways. If to. I know I don't have to, she said. He didn't argue. Marcus Holloway dismounted in the yard with the ease of a man who considered every stood on to, in some sense, already his. He was well-dressed for a ranch visit, deliberate about it. The kind of well-dressed that was meant to communicate something about the distance between his life and yours. He was maybe 50, big through the shoulders, a face that had probably been handsome once and had settled into something harder. He smiled when he saw Ethan. The smile did not reach anything north of his mouth. Calloway. He looked at the ranch yard with the particular gaze of a man taking inventory. Norm treat you rough? We managed, Ethan said. Heard you lost some fence on the east side. Fixed it. Holloway's eyes moved to Clara. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the ranch, assessing value, calculating weakness. Your bride, he said. My wife, Ethan said. Flat, precise. The difference between the 2 words said everything. Holloway tipped his hat to Clara with the courtliness of a man who had learned that manners were useful tools. Ma'am, Marcus Holloway. I ranch the land east and north of here. I know who you are, Clara said pleasantly. Something flickered in Holloway's eyes. People who looked like Clara, quiet-dressed, soft-voiced, usually performed a certain kind of deference when introduced to a man like him. Hadn't. He shifted his attention back to Ethan. Aimed to see how the storm damage looked. Neighborly. He paused, the pause of a man who wanted you to notice it. Also wanted to renew my offer, given the circumstances. Circumstances, Ethan said. Storm damage. Water table's been dropping every year. Cattle prices are soft. Holloway shrugged with the performance of a man being reasonable. I'm prepared to be generous, more generous than I was in October. The answer's still no, Ethan said. Holloway smiled again. The answer's no today. But a man in your position ought to think about next year. And the year after. He looked at the ranch house. The outbuildings. The land that ran north toward the water access that he wanted more than any of it. This is a hard place to hold, Calloway. Harder with a family. He glanced at Clara again. The glance of a man delivering a message through a look. Clara spoke before Ethan could, Mr. Holloway. Her voice was polite and completely without warmth. I've been going through the ranch account since I arrived. I've found several discrepancies that we're in the process of correcting, and once those corrections are in order, this ranch's financial position will be considerably stronger than it may appear from the outside. A pause. Size is a surgical instrument. So if your offer is based on an assumption of weakness, I'd encourage you to recalculate. Holloway turned to look at her fully. The smile was still there, but something behind it had changed. The way a man looks when he's encountered something that doesn't fit his preparation. That's so, he said. That's so, she said. He looked at Ethan. Look of a man. Checking whether the woman had permission to speak. Ethan looked back at him with the specific expression of a man who found that question insulting. Heard her, Ethan said. Holloway looked between them for a moment. Recalibrating. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man storing information he intends to use later. And I'll leave you to it then. He turned toward his horse. Stopped, looked back. Storm like that takes down more than fences, Calloway. That. He mounted. My offer stands, for now. He rode out with his two silent men behind him. The yard was quiet. Tom appeared from the direction of the stable, moving with the deliberate casualness of a man who had definitely been within earshot, and was choosing not to acknowledge it. Ethan stood looking at the road where Holloway's gray horse had disappeared. You didn't need to do that, he said to Clara. No, she said. I know. A pause. He won't forget it. Good. She turned toward the house. Men like that are easier to manage when they've underestimated you, and you've let them know they shouldn't. She stopped at the door. He looked back. He'll come at the accounts next. Try to find something he can use. We need everything clean and documented before he does. Ethan looked at her. She waited. Thank you, he said. She nodded once and went inside. Tom moved up beside Ethan and they both looked at the empty road. Boss, Tom said. Don't, Ethan said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were about to say something. Tom was quiet for a moment. I was going to say, she's got good instincts, he said. That's all. Ethan said nothing. But he looked at the door she'd walked for a long moment before he went back to work. She found the document on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the storm. She had been working through the land papers, the original deed, the boundary surveys, the water rights filings, because something Holloway had said about the water access had unsettled her in a way she couldn't name until she sat down with the papers themselves. It was tucked behind the original deed in a leather folder that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Letter, on official-looking stationery, dated September 1882. From a land office in Cheyenne. She read it once. Read it again. Then she sat very still for almost a minute. Then she got up and went to find Ethan. He was in the north pasture, checking the repaired fence. She walked the whole way without hurrying, because hurrying would mean letting the alarm she felt show on her face, and she needed to think before she said anything. He saw her coming and stopped what he was doing. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His face didn't change, exactly, but something in his body did, some quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. The stillness of a man reading something that explains things he'd noticed, but couldn't account for. You knew about this, she said, not an accusation. A question. I knew there was a dispute, he said slowly. 3 years ago, someone filed a counterclaim on the North Boundary Survey. It went to the land office in Cheyenne, and they said they'd look into it. I never heard back. You never heard back because this letter says the inquiry was closed. She pointed to the relevant paragraph. But look at the signature. He looked. The land agent who had signed off on the closure was a man named R. Eve Aldridge. Aldridge. The same name as the lawyer in Bitter Creek whose wife had made comments in the Mercantile about Clara's father being a drinker. Lawyer in town, Clara said. Richard Aldridge. Ethan's voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard before. He's Holloway's lawyer. They looked at each other across the cold pasture. Someone filed a false counterclaim on your north boundary, Clara said. And the man who handled the inquiry for the land office in Cheyenne is the same man who handles Marcus Holloway's legal work in Bitter Creek. That could be coincidence. It could be. She said it in a tone that communicated clearly what she thought of that possibility. Ethan handed the letter back. His jaw was working. The way it did when he was running something through the part of his mind that handled things he didn't want to be true. If the boundary claim is fraudulent, Aiden, she said, and if it was handled by a compromised agent, then the closure of that inquiry is invalid. Which means Holloway has been operating under the assumption that your north boundary is in question when legally it may not be. She paused. And he's been using that assumption to pressure you. For 3 years, Ethan said. For 3 years. He was quiet for a long moment. What do we do with it, he said. We write to the federal land office, she said. Not Cheyenne, federal. We document the conflict of interest. We request the inquiry be reopened under a different agent. She looked at him. Do you have the original survey records, not just the deed, the actual survey markers and measurements? My father kept everything. Then we have something to work with. Ethan looked at her for a long, serious moment. This will make Holloway dangerous, he said. Not just difficult, dangerous. Yes, she said. You understand that. Anne, I understand it. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as the one that appeared when she did something that made him revise his understanding of what she was. Not surprise anymore. Something closer to recognition. Were you always like this, he said. She blinked. Like what, this? He gestured, a small movement, vague but somehow encompassing her completely. Fearless. Something moved through her. She pressed it down. I'm not fearless, she said. I'm just better at being afraid quietly. She turned and walked back toward the ranch house. And behind her, Ethan Calloway stood in the north pasture in the January cold and watched her go and felt something's pulling at the walls he'd maintained for 11 years like wind, pulling at a poorly patched fence. It was working on him, slowly, steadily, the way water worked on stone. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Friday evening in late January. It was not supposed to change anything. It was just dinner time, and the four hands at the long table in the kitchen, Clara moving between the stove and the table with the easy competence she'd developed over weeks, Ethan at the head of the table for the first time since she'd arrived. That was the first change. He had moved to the main table 2 weeks after the blizzard, without discussion, without ceremony. One evening, he simply pulled out the chair at the head and sat down, and Billy had looked at Tom, and Tom had looked at his plate, and nobody said a word. Conversation at the table was easy, the way it had become easy Tom's dry observations about the weather and the cattle, Billy's stories about town. The quiet back and forth of people who had worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. Clara was refilling Tom's coffee when young Billy Marsh, who had the self-preservation instincts of a man who had never learned caution, said, "Nerd Holloway's been talking in town." Ranch. The table went quiet, not silent. But quieter. "What's he saying?" Tom said in the tone of a man who already knows and is asking for verification. That the storm did more damage than it looked. That Calloway's north fence is still compromised. Billy paused. And that the water rights on the north boundary are. He hesitated, aware that he'd started a sentence he wasn't sure how to finish, still unresolved. Ethan said nothing. Clara set the coffee pot down. "He's preparing the ground," she said, not to the table specifically. Almost to herself. "Telling the story before we can tell it differently." She looked at Ethan. "Has Aldridge filed anything recently? Any new paperwork with the county?" Ethan looked at her. Not that I know of. Then he hasn't moved yet. He's testing the reaction. She sat back down, which means we have time. Billy was looking back and forth between them, with the expression of a young man watching something he didn't but recognized as significant. Was watching too, with the more experienced eyes of a man who understood exactly what he was seeing. The letter the Federal Land Office, Clara said to Ethan. I need you to sign it this week, and I need the survey records your father kept. All of them. I can have them by tomorrow. Tonight would be better. He looked at her across the table. Tonight, he said. Night, she said. Tom picked up his coffee with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that whatever this was, it was above his pay grade and probably the best thing that had happened to Callaway Ranch in 11 years. And he was going to keep his mouth shut and let it work. They were at the kitchen table until past midnight. Survey records spread between them, the federal complaint being drafted in Clara's small, precise hand. Ethan reading, and commenting, correcting he knew this land the way he knew his own hands. Every ridge and marker, every place where the survey posts had been set by men he'd known as a boy. She asked questions and he answered them, and she wrote, and occasionally she would read back a sentence and he would say more specific or that's right, and she would adjust and keep going. Around 10 o'clock he went and got the coffee without being asked, and poured 2 cups without asking if she wanted one, and set hers on the table near her elbow and sat back down. She looked at the cup, then at him. He had already gone back to the survey map. Went back to writing. But her hand wasn't entirely steady for the next few minutes, and she was glad he wasn't looking. By midnight they had a draft. Clara read it back to him in full. Formal and precise and completely damning in its documentation of A.P. Aldridge's conflict of interest and the procedural irregularities in the 1,882 inquiry. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. It's good, Ethan said. It's accurate, she said. Whether it's good depends on whether the federal office cares about accuracy more than they care about convenience. You think they might not. I think bureaucracies make their own weather. She set the papers down. But this is the right thing to do, whatever happens. He looked at the document on the table, the document she'd built out of his father's surveys and her own legal knowledge she'd gathered from books, from her uncle, from years of watching how the world worked and understanding that knowing your rights was the only real protection a person without money or connections could manage. You learn all this, he said. What specifically? Land law, water rights, how to build a formal complaint. She was quiet for a moment. My father lost his farm when I was 12, she said. We didn't have money for a lawyer. We didn't know what filings existed, or what protections the law offered, or what questions to ask. She looked at the document. We lost it because we didn't know what we didn't know. She paused. I decided after that I would always know. Ethan looked at her for a long time. I'm sorry, he said. About the farm. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it not worth being sorry about. Look up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something open in a way that his face didn't usually allow. Something that had come to the surface in the middle of a midnight kitchen, the way things surfaced in the middle of the night when the usual defenses were tired. No, she said very quietly. I suppose it doesn't. They looked at each other across the survey maps and the draft complaint and the remains of 2 cups of coffee. Then Clara picked up her pen and began the final copy. Ethan watched her write, in the steady way of a man who has discovered that watching a particular person do an ordinary thing is, for reasons he cannot entirely account for, the thing he most wants to be doing. He did not say that. He would not have known how, but he stayed at that table until she was done. The final copy was sealed and addressed on Saturday morning. Billy wrote it to town to go out with the first post. Ethan watched Billy went around the front of the ranch house. He heard Clara come up behind him. He'd learned the particular sound of her footsteps, lighter on the left foot, a barely their rhythm he could identify now through walls. Sent, she said. It's sent, he confirmed. They stood looking at the empty road. Going to find out, Ethan said. Probably. Aldridge will tell him. Someone at the post will mention it. This valley has no secrets. No. When he finds out, he won't just make offers anymore. Clara was quiet for a moment. I know that too. He turned to look at her. Yeah. Standing beside him in the January morning, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her expression the one she wore when she had made a decision and wasn't going to be moved from it. Are you frightened? He said. She considered the question honestly. So am I, he said. It cost him something to say that. She could hear it. 11 years of managing everything alone meant that I'm frightened was practically a foreign language in his mouth. Ethan. She turned to face him. Whatever he does, we have the truth on our side. And the documents. And enough lead time to establish our case before he can muddy it. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not nothing. Looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He reached out and took her hand. Not romantically. Not with any gesture toward what it might mean. Just took her hand the way a man reaches for solid ground when the footing gets uncertain. Her hand in his in the cold January air, with the empty road in front of them and trouble coming from the east and the federal mail on its way to Cheyenne. She didn't pull away. She held on, and they stood there like that for a moment that was brief and cold and completely unremarkable to anyone who might have passed on the road. Clara Whitmore, who had spent 20 years being overlooked and underestimated and quietly set aside. A man reaching for her hand in a difficult moment was not unremarkable at all. It was, in fact, everything. She didn't let herself say that. But she felt it, down to the bone. 3 days later, Richard Aldridge rode out to the ranch. No Marcus Holloway, no hired men, just the lawyer himself in his town coat, on a horse that suggested he did not do a great deal of actual riding. Ethan saw him coming and sent Tom to find Clara. By the time Aldridge dismounted in the yard, both of them were there. Aldridge was a slim man, mid-40s, the kind of face that was accustomed to negotiating. He had the practiced pleasantness of a man who used good manners the way other men used tools precisely, when needed, and put away when they weren't. Calloway, he said. Yeah. Then a beat late, with the particular smile he'd probably been practicing on the ride over, Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Clara said. What can we do for you? He looked between them. Recalibrating, she could see it, the same way Holloway had recalibrated in the yard 3 weeks ago. I heard you sent some paperwork to the Federal Land Office, he said. Conversational, easy. The tone of a man who wants you to believe the information cost him nothing to obtain. That's right, Ethan said. Mind if I ask what about? The 1082 boundary inquiry, Clara said. We found some procedural irregularities we thought the federal office should be aware of. Aldridge's smile stayed in place. Impressive, she thought. It was a good smile to maintain under those circumstances. Irregularities, he said. Conflict of interest, specifically, she said. In the handling agent's relationship with a third party who stood to benefit from the inquiry's outcome. A pause. The smile was still there, but something behind it had shifted. The way a house looks the same from the outside after the foundation cracks. Those are serious allegations, he said. They're documented allegations, she said. Which is a different thing. He looked at Ethan. The look of a man trying to find the angle which of these two was the softer point of entry, which one could be reasoned with, which one was uncertain enough to be worked. Ethan looked back at him with the specific expression of a man who had lived alone on a hard piece of land for 11 years and was not moved by soft pressure. Mr. Aldridge, Ethan said. If you came to suggest we withdraw the complaint, you've had a cold ride for nothing. Aldridge's smile finally made it to his eyes, but not warm. I came as a neighbor, Calloway. Out of courtesy, Marcus Holloway is a powerful man in this valley. I'd hate to see a misunderstanding damage what could be a productive relationship. Misunderstanding, Clara said. Misunderstanding, he confirmed. Looked at him for a long moment. Aldridge, she said, I was raised in a town where men like Marcus Holloway used words like productive relationship and misunderstanding, and neighborly to explain why other people's property kept ending up in their names. She paused. I know what those words mean. I suspect you know I know, she held his gaze. The complaint stands, and if Mr. Holloway would like to discuss the water rights question through legitimate legal channels, we're available to do that. The yard was very quiet. Aldridge looked at her for a full 5 seconds. Then he put his hat back on. Good day, Mrs. Calloway, he said. He mounted and rode out. Tom appeared from behind the stable. He had clearly been within earshot again. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man watching something he would be telling stories about for years. Ma'am, he said. Tom, she replied and went inside. Ethan stood in the yard a moment longer. He was looking at the road. Yeah. But he was thinking about the woman who had just dressed down Marcus Holloway's lawyer in his own front yard with the calm, measured precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment without knowing it, for years. Thought about a farm lost when she was 12, a father who drank, a town that looked through her, telegrams she'd answered not out of desperation, but out of a particular quality of courage that looked, from the outside, like something quieter than it was. He turned and went inside. She was at the stove. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and she turned and looked at him, and he couldn't find the words for what he wanted to say, which was that he had spent 11 years running this ranch, without anyone at his side who understood the weight of it. And for the first time since his father died, he did not feel alone in it. What he said was, "Thank you." Again, still, the only two words that seemed to hold the right weight when the larger thing was too big to carry out into the open air. Him for a moment. Go eat something, she said. You haven't had lunch. He sat down. She put food in front of him. Yeah. And the afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, and somewhere outside, Tom was telling Billy something that made Billy laugh, and the ranch went on doing what ranches do, which is persist, day after day. Through weather and threat and human difficulty and all the rest. Persisted, they both did. And between two people who had chosen each other out of necessity and found something neither of them had language. For yet something was building steady and quiet, sure the way water builds behind a dam, patient and inevitable, and waiting for the moment when it would have no choice but to change the shape of the land entirely. The federal response came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Billy had ridden the complaint to the post office in Bitter Creek. Clara heard the horse before she heard Billy's voice, and she was already at the kitchen door when he came in with his coat still on and an envelope held out in front of him like it was either very good news or very bad news, and he hadn't decided which. Came with the Morning Post, he said. Federal seal. She took it, turned it over in her hands once. Then she went to find Ethan. He was in the stable, and he saw her face. She came through the door and stopped what he was doing immediately. She handed him the envelope without speaking. He looked at the seal. Looked at her. Then he opened it. She watched him read. His face was the careful, controlled face he wore when something mattered enough that he didn't trust his expression with it. She had learned to read him in the past 2 months, the way you learn to read a sky you'd been watching long enough, not through obvious signals but through the small ones. Set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands. His hands were very still. They're reopening the inquiry, he said. She breathed. They're sending an agent from the federal office in Denver, he continued. Not Cheyenne. Denver. He looked back at the letter. They want access to all original survey documents and any correspondence related to the 1882 filing. When? 4 weeks. Clara sat down on the nearest bale without caring that it wasn't a chair. She put both hands flat on her knees and felt the weeks of careful work, the letters, the documents, the midnight hours at the kitchen table, arrive at their first real consequence. He's going to know today, she said. Holloway. Someone at the federal office will mention it, or Aldridge will hear through his Cheyenne contacts. Yes. Then we have 4 weeks before the agent arrives, and we have no idea what Holloway does in those 4 weeks. No. Ethan folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket. Don't. Are you afraid? Yes, he said. Same way he'd said it on the porch in January, with the same quality of a man who found honesty costly but paid it anyway. She stood. Good, fear's useful if you don't let it make decisions for you. She straightened her dress. We need to organize the survey documents tonight. Everything your father kept. Everything we've already pulled indexed and in order before that agent arrives. Clara. She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression that still, after 2 months, made something pull tight in her chest when she wasn't guarding against it. We did this, he said. You did this. I want you to know I understand that. She held his gaze for one careful moment. We have time to be grateful later, she said. Right now we have work to do. She walked back toward the ranch house and told herself the tightness in her chest was just the cold air. She didn't entirely believe it. Holloway moved faster than either of them expected. Man. 3 days after the federal letter arrived, Tom came in from the north pasture with a look on his face that Clara had learned to take seriously, the one that meant something had happened that wasn't weather-related and wasn't good. Riders, he said to Ethan, 3 of them, came up along the north boundary line this morning. Didn't come to the yard, just rode the fence line slow and turned back. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Any of them Holloway's men? The big one on the roan was. Don't know the other 2. Just after sunrise, Clara was at the table with the survey documents and she set down her pen. Checking the boundary markers, she said. Both men looked at her. Yeah. If he's planning to contest the survey before the federal agent arrives, he needs to know exactly where the markers are. Which ones might be ambiguous, which ones he can argue. Ethan looked at Tom. The north markers, how are they? Tom was quiet for the half-second of a man choosing honesty over reassurance. 2 of them have been there since your father's time. Posts are old, weathered, readable, depends on who's reading them and how much they want to argue. Ethan turned to Clara. What does he need to file a counter-survey? An independent surveyor and a filing with the county before the federal agent arrives, she said immediately. If he can get a surveyor to sign off on disputed markers before Denver sends their man, it creates a conflict of record that could slow everything down. She paused. Significantly slow it down. How long would that buy him? Months, maybe longer, depending on how cooperative the county clerk is. She looked at him directly. Is the county clerk cooperative with Holloway? Ethan's jaw worked. His brother-in-law plays cards with Aldridge every Friday night. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Clara stood up. How far is the north boundary line? Can we get there before dark? Ethan and Tom exchanged a look. What are you thinking? Ethan said. I want to see those markers myself, she said. Before anyone else decides what they say. They rode out within the hour, all 3 of them, with the survey documents folded in Clara's saddlebag and the kind of purposeful silence that meant everyone understood the stakes. Knackler rode the way she did everything, without performance, without asking for accommodation. She'd been riding since she was 9, and she managed the unfamiliar horse with the quiet competence that Ethan had stopped being surprised by and had started simply expecting, the way you started expecting the sun to come up on the east side. North markers were exactly what Tom had described. Old. Weathered. The posts themselves were solid enough, but the survey notations on the iron caps were worn smooth in places, the way iron wore when it had been sitting in Wyoming weather for 25 years. Clara crouched down next to the first one and looked at it for a long time. Then she pulled out the survey document from her saddlebag and held it next to the marker. Ethan crouched beside her. What do you see? He said. Notation on the cap matches the document, she said. But the wear pattern here, she traced a finger along the iron edge without touching it, could be argued as degraded. A surveyor who wanted to claim ambiguity could make that argument. He win it? Not if we photograph it. She looked up at him. Is there a photographer in Bitter Creek? Hale's got a studio. Can he come tomorrow? I'll send Billy tonight. She nodded and stood and looked out along the fence line, where Holloway's men had ridden that morning. The boundary of everything Ethan had built on his father's 40 acres and a promise. Line between what was his and what a powerful man wanted to take from him. Ethan. She didn't look at him when she said it. If Holloway files a counter-survey and ties this up in county records, the federal agent won't be able to make a clean ruling. He'll have to wait for the conflict to resolve. I know. And while it's resolving, Holloway can make this ranch difficult in other ways. Water access, grazing dispute supply routes. She paused. He doesn't have to win the legal case to win. He just has to make holding this ranch expensive enough that you can't sustain it. Ethan was quiet beside her. What are you telling me? He said. She turned to look at him. I'm telling you that this fight is going to be harder than the blizzard and longer than a winter. She held his gaze. And I want to know if you're ready for it. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you? He said. She didn't hesitate. Yes, then I am too, he said. Nam, who had given them the privacy of looking at the fence line 20 feet away, chose this moment to clear his throat. Boss, there's something else. They both turned. Tom's face was the face of a man who had been deciding for the past hour whether to say what he was about to say. One of those riders this morning. The two I didn't recognize. He paused. They asked around this afternoon. One of them is a surveyor. Works out of Laramie. Name's Curtis Fenn. Clara and Ethan looked at each other. He's already hired a surveyor, Clara said. He's not waiting, Ethan said. No. She turned back toward the horses. Neither are we. The photographer came on Wednesday. Hale was a small, precise man who understood that his job was to document and not to ask questions, and he did it efficiently. Every marker on the north boundary line, survey notations on the iron caps, the fence posts and their relationship to the documented boundary, all of it captured on glass plates that would become the most important photographs in Callaway Ranch's history. Clara stood beside him at each marker and read him the corresponding notation from the survey document while he worked, establishing a clear verbal record that Tom and Billy both witnessed. It was done. She had Hale make 2 sets of prints. One for the federal agent, one to be held by someone outside the valley. Who do you trust outside the valley? She asked Ethan that evening. Mother's brother in Rollins, he said, without hesitation. He's not connected to anything here. Holloway doesn't know him. Write to him tonight, she said. Send the second set of photographs with the letter. And tell him to hold them and release them only to federal official or on your written instruction. Ethan looked at her across the kitchen table. You've done this before, he said. Not an accusation. The same tone he'd used in the north pasture, the one that was trying to understand her. Yeah. I've watched people lose things they shouldn't have lost, she said. Because they didn't make copies. Because they kept everything in one place. Because they trusted that right would be obvious without being documented. She looked at the photograph. Right is never obvious without documentation. He wrote the letter that night. Meh. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Callaway Ranch, Clara let herself think that they might actually win this. She pressed that thought down quickly, because hope was a thing she had learned to handle carefully like a lamp in the wind. You cupped your hands around it, but you didn't claim it was safe yet. But she felt it, small and steady in her chest, like a fire that someone had finally bothered to build right. The county clerk filed Curtis Fenn's counter-survey on a Thursday. Billy found out at the feed store, where someone's wife mentioned it to someone's husband, mentioned it to Billy while loading grain, and Billy rode back to the ranch at a pace that suggested he understood the urgency without being told. Ethan was in the yard when Billy came in. Counter-surveys filed, Billy said, still breathless. Ethan went still. What county filing number? Clara said from the doorway. Billy blinked at her. Ma'am? Filing number, did they say? No, ma'am, go back and find out. She looked at Ethan. We need the filing number today so we can attach it to our federal submission. If it's in the county record before the agent arrives, we can document that it was filed after our federal complaint, which establishes the sequence. I looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded once. Billy turned his horse and went back. Ethan came to stand at the bottom of the porch steps. Can the sequence actually help us? If the federal agent is doing his job, yes, she said. It shows Holloway responded to our complaint by filing a counterclaim which is reactive, not original. An original property dispute would have been filed years ago. She paused. He didn't file it years ago because he didn't have grounds. He filed it now because he's trying to create grounds. Ethan looked at her for a moment. How do you know that's how the agent will see it? I don't, she said honestly, but it's how an honest man would see it. And the federal office in Denver sent their own agent rather than using Cheyenne. That's a signal that someone up there cares about getting this right. He nodded slowly. And if the agent isn't honest, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then we publish everything we have to every newspaper in Wyoming Territory, and let public attention do what federal process won't, she said. He looked at her with the expression that had become, in 2 months, something she could not entirely look at directly because of what it did to the place behind her ribs. You thought of that already, he said. I think of everything, she said. It's the only advantage I've ever had. The twist came from a direction neither of them was watching. 3 days before the federal agent was due to arrive from Denver, a woman came to the ranch. Not Holloway, not Aldridge, not any of the men they'd been preparing for. A woman. She arrived in a hired buggy in the mid-morning, and she was well dressed in the way of someone who had come from somewhere with more amenities than Bitter Creek offered. Dark coat, good boots. The posture of a woman who had learned that posture was something you didn't surrender to circumstance. Clara was the one who met her at the yard. She took one look at the woman's face, dark eyes, strong jaw, the particular expression of someone who has made themselves come somewhere they didn't want to be, and felt something she couldn't name move through her. I'm looking for Ethan Calloway, the woman said. He's here, Clara said. I'm his wife. Can I help you? The woman looked at her. Something moved across her face, complex, not unfriendly but not uncomplicated. My name is Eleanor Fenn, the woman said. Curtis Fenn is my husband. The surveyor. Clara kept her face entirely still. Would you like to come inside, she said. Ethan came in from the stable to find Clara, and a stranger sitting at his kitchen table with coffee between them and an atmosphere in the room that he couldn't immediately classify. Nah. Clara looked at him with the slight expression that meant she needed him to listen more than he needed to talk. He sat down. Mrs. Fenn's husband is the surveyor Holloway, Clara said. Ethan looked at the woman. Eleanor Fenn looked back at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent the ride out from town deciding exactly how much to say. Mr. Calloway, she said, my husband is a good surveyor and an honest man. He was hired to do a professional survey of the north boundary markers. She paused. What he wasn't told, what I don't believe he fully understood when he accepted the work, was that Marcus Holloway intended to use that survey as part of a legal effort to challenge your title. The kitchen was very quiet. What changed? Ethan said. Eleanor looked at her coffee. Curtis came home 2 nights ago and told me about the markers. What he'd found, what he'd been asked to write in his report. She paused. He found the markers consistent with your survey documents. Both of them. All of them. She looked up. Holloway's man told him to note the wear degradation on the caps and characterize it as creating ambiguity regarding the original placement. Clara's hands were still on the table. Did your husband write that in his report? She said. Not yet. Eleanor looked at her directly. He's been sitting with it for 2 days. He knows what Holloway wants him to say, and he knows what the markers actually show. And he knows those are 2 different things. Ethan said nothing. They said nothing. Eleanor Fenn said he won't falsify a survey. He never has, but Holloway has already paid him, and if Curtis refuses to deliver the report as Holloway wants it, she stopped. We have a daughter in Laramie. Curtis has worked this region for 15 years. Holloway has long hands. The thing that had been unsaid finally sat on the table between them all. What do you need from us? Clara said. Eleanor looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been hoping someone would ask exactly that question. I need to know, she said carefully, that if my husband submits an honest report, one that contradicts what paid him, to say that there is a legal process in place that will protect his professional standing. That his honest report will matter. Clara and Ethan looked at each other. One look, the whole conversation happening in it. Ethan turned back to Eleanor Fenn. The federal agent arrives in 3 days, he said. From Denver, we have photographic documentation of every boundary marker and a federal complaint on record that predates your husband's counter-survey filing. Eleanor absorbed that. If your husband submits us an honest report, Clara said, it will directly corroborate our documentation, and the federal agent will have 2 independent sources that agree. She paused. The counter-survey becomes evidence against Holloway's position rather than for it. Eleanor was quiet. He could lose the fee, she said. He could, Clara said. I won't pretend otherwise. Holloway will know it was Curtis who contradicted him. Eleanor looked at her hands, then she looked up. My husband is a good man, she said. He should have asked more questions before he took this work. He knows that. She stood. I came because I needed to know there was something worth the risk of him being honest. She straightened her coat. Now I know. Clara and Ethan sat at the kitchen table in the silence she'd left behind. She came here on her own, Ethan said finally. He doesn't know she came. No, Clara said. She's going to go home and tell him what she found out. He was quiet for a moment. That's a brave woman. Looked at the door. Eleanor Fenn had walked out of. Yes, she said. It is. She said it in a tone that suggested she understood something about what that courage had cost, because she was familiar with the particular quality of fear that came from walking into a situation that mattered and not knowing how it would land. She was familiar with it because she had been living inside it for 2 months. Curtis Fenn delivered his survey report to the county clerk on a Friday morning. Billy found out before noon, rode back hard, came into the yard where Ethan and Clara were both standing because they'd both heard the horse, and neither of them had pretended otherwise. N's report says the markers are consistent with the original survey documents, Billy said, barely off the horse. No ambiguity noted. The yard was very still. Then, Ethan made a sound that Clara had never heard from him. Low, brief, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. Holloway's going to know today, Tom said from behind them. It'd come from the stable. He'll be angry. Yes, Tom was quiet for a moment. You want me to put someone on the north fence line tonight?
Just to be sure.
Ethan nodded. Tom went to arrange it. Clara stood beside Ethan in the yard and felt the weight of the week settle and shift. Not resolve it wasn't over. The federal agent hadn't arrived yet. Holloway hadn't made his next move. There was more ahead, and they both knew it. But something had shifted. An honest man had chosen honesty when dishonesty was safer. And the ground under Callaway Ranch felt, for the first time since November, like ground that was going to hold. The federal agent's name was Tusterber, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning in a manner Jess, who had done this work long enough to know that the important things happened before the official meetings, not during them. He was maybe 45, quietly dressed. He had the specific quality of attention that Clara had learned to recognize in people who were actually good at their jobs, the kind that noticed everything, without making a performance of noticing. He spent the first morning at the ranch, going through documents. Not asking questions yet, just reading. The original deed, the survey records, Clara's indexed files, the correspondence with the federal office, the counter-survey filing, Fenn's honest report. Everything. Clara sat at the far end of the table and worked on the accounts and said nothing. Ethan checked on the cattle, and came back and said nothing. They had both understood, without discussing it, that Garrett was the kind of man you didn't perform for. Around midday, Garrett looked up. He looked at Clara. Organize these files, he said. Yes, the indexing system. The cross-references between the survey documents and the photographs. He looked at her for a moment. This is careful work, Mrs. Callaway. It needed to be, she said. He went back to reading. Later that afternoon, he asked Ethan to walk him to the north boundary line. Ethan went. Clara stayed at the table and kept working, because the work kept her steady, and because there was nothing she could do at the boundary line that Ethan couldn't do. And because she needed 15 minutes alone in the kitchen to let herself feel the full weight of what the next day or two would determine. Everything but since November. The ledgers and the letters, and the midnight hours and the cold ride to the boundary markers in January. The complaint and the photographs and Eleanor Fenn sitting at this table with her coffee and her courage. All of it moving toward a federal agent who was either going to see what was true or he wasn't. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She thought about her father's farm, lost when she was 12. She thought about a telegram torn in half and burned in a kitchen fire before she'd ever arrived. She thought about a man who said thank you like the words cost him something and meant them more than other men meant their grandest speeches. She thought about $64.30. She almost smiled. Then she heard horses in the yard and stood up. It wasn't Garrett coming back. It was Holloway. He came with 4 men this time. Not 2, 4, and he didn't stop at the edge of the yard. He rode straight in like a man who had decided that courtesy was a strategy he was done employing. Claire was at the door before they'd fully stopped. Nay, she stepped out onto the porch. Holloway looked at her from his horse with an expression that had dropped all the neighborly warmth he'd been managing for months. "Where's Calloway?" he said. "Not here at the moment," she said. "I'm his wife. You can speak to me." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he dismounted, came to the base of the porch steps. Of his men stayed on their horses. 2 dismounted and stood flanking him with the deliberate posture of men whose purpose was to communicate size. "Federal agent is here," Holloway said. "Yes," Clara said. "He came to my ranch this morning, asked questions." Holloway's voice was carefully controlled. "Nah. About my relationship with Richard Aldridge. About the 1882 filing." "Nay." She said nothing. "You want to tell me," he said, voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous than his usual register, "what exactly you put in that federal complaint?" "Nair. I want to tell you, Aiden," she said, "that everything in that complaint is documented and photographed, and copies exist in 3 locations, none of which is in this valley." She held his gaze without moving. "And I want to tell you that Curtis Fenn's survey report, which you paid for and did not receive what you paid for, is now part of the federal record." Something moved across Holloway's face. Rage, contained behind the discipline of a man who had learned that visible rage was a weakness. But it was there. She could see it the way you could see fire behind a closed window, the light, even if not the heat. "You think you've been very clever," he said. "I think I've been very accurate," she said. "That's different. This valley doesn't forget, Mrs. Calloway." He said her name the way a man laid down a card he believed would take the hand. And it doesn't forgive people who make enemies they can't manage." She stood at the top of those porch steps and looked down at Marcus Holloway and his 4 men in her yard and felt fear, real, physical fear, the kind that lived in the stomach and felt it fully and did not move. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I grew up with nothing. I came to this territory with 1 trunk and no connections and no one in this valley who owed me anything." Her voice was level. "I have managed difficult things before. I intend to keep managing them." She paused. "What I don't intend is to be intimidated in my own yard." The yard held its breath. Then from the road the sound of 2 horses. Ethan and Garrett rode in together. Garrett took in the scene Holloway, his 4 men, Clara on the porch steps with the practiced assessment of a federal agent who had seen the shape of kind of situation before. Holloway turned. The 2 men looked at each other. "Mr. Holloway," Garrett said pleasantly, "I was going to stop by your ranch tomorrow morning." The trip?" Holloway looked at Garrett, then at Ethan. Then, briefly, at Clara. Something went out of him. Not all the way men like Holloway didn't surrender. They recalculated. But something went out of him in that moment, that yard, with a federal agent sitting a horse 6 feet away and a woman at the top of the porch steps who hadn't moved an inch. We'll talk tomorrow, Holloway said to Garrett. I look forward to it, Garrett said. Holloway mounted. His 4 men mounted. They rode out. The yard was quiet. Garrett dismounted and handed his reins to Tom, who had appeared, again, from the direction of the stable. Ethan came to the porch. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. His face was doing something complicated, several things at once, the way faces did when the emotion was too large to land on just one expression. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the boundary markers in January. Like a man making absolutely certain of something before he committed to believing it. You're out here alone with him, he said. I was, she said. Yes. You didn't move. No. Nay. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her, and the afternoon light was doing something particular to the angle of his face. And Clara felt the thing she had been carefully not naming for 2 months arrive in her chest, with a force that made it very difficult to maintain the composure she had been maintaining all afternoon. Clara. His voice was quiet, the voice he used when something was costing him enough that he had to go carefully with it. Ethan, she said, I need to say something. He put one hand on the porch railing. And I'm going to say it wrong, because I've never, he stopped. Again, I have been alone on this ranch for 11 years. And in that time I convinced myself that alone was what I was suited for. That the arrangement I'd made with the world work, land, nothing complicated, was the right one for a man like me. She held very still, and then you came, he said. With your 1 trunk and your ledgers and your $64.30 and your letter to the federal land office. He looked at her steadily. And I have been trying for 2 months to explain to myself what's happened to me. I've been trying to put it in a category I recognize. He paused. I can't. The porch steps between them felt very small. I can tell you, he said, is that when I rode into that yard just now and saw you standing on those steps with Holloway and his men, his jaw worked. I have never been so frightened in my life, and I have never been so. He stopped again. What? She said softly. Proud, he said, of another person. Clara Whitmore, who had managed fear and lawyers and blizzards and ledgers and an entire territorial land dispute without her composure cracking once, felt her eyes fill. She pressed it back. You said it perfectly, she said, when she trusted her voice. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he came up the steps. And he did what he had done once on a cold January morning. He reached for her hand. But this time it was not the grip of himself on uncertain ground. It was the grip of a man who had found it. She held on. Anner. Behind them, inside the ranch house, Thomas Garrett was sitting at the kitchen table, going through documents. Outside, Tom was telling Billy something in a low voice, and the ranch went on the way it always did, persistent, unglamorous, real. Out on that porch in the late afternoon of a Wyoming February, something that had been building since a telegram was torn in half and burned in a kitchen fire, finally arrived at the surface. Not with speeches, not with grand gestures, with a held hand. Understanding, shared and silent and absolute, that neither of them was alone anymore. And hadn't been, perhaps, since the very first morning said, across a full 64 table and 30 cents, like it was the beginning of something. It had been from the very first word. Thomas Garrett spent 3 days at Callaway Ranch. He was methodical in the way of a man who understood that the work he did mattered beyond the specific case in front of him, that federal land decisions in Wyoming Territory, in 1885, were not just about one ranch and one boundary line. About the shape of everything that came after. He said this to no one, but Clara understood it from the way he worked, and the understanding made her more careful, not less. On the first evening, Garrett sat at the kitchen table after supper and asked questions. Not aggressive questions. The careful, incremental questions of a man building a structure he intended to be sound. He asked Ethan about his father's original purchase. The 40 acres. The expansion. Every transaction documented in the deed records that Clara had indexed and cross-referenced with a precision that Garrett had already noted and not commented on directly. He asked Clara how she had identified the conflict of interest in the 1882 filing. She told him, simply without embellishment, the letter behind the deed. Signature. The name that connected Aldridge to Holloway. Garrett wrote in his notebook. And the photographs, he said. Mine, Clara said. He looked at her. You anticipated that the markers might be challenged. I anticipated that a man who had already filed a fraudulent inquiry once would look for another point of pressure, she said. The markers were the obvious choice. Garrett looked at her for a moment, in the way he had of looking assessing without performance. Mrs. Calloway, he said, how long have you been at this ranch? 3 months, she said. He wrote something in his notebook that she couldn't read from across the table. Ethan, sitting beside her, said nothing, but his hand, which had been resting on the table near hers, moved an inch closer. She noticed. She didn't move away. On the second morning, Garrett rode out to the boundary line alone. He took the photographs and the survey documents, and he spent 4 hours out there, and when he came back his coat was cold and his face told nothing about what he'd concluded. He asked Tom 2 questions. Tom answered them in the direct, unadorned way that Tom answered everything, which Clara suspected was more useful to Garrett than any prepared statement could have been. In the afternoon, Garrett rode to Bitter Creek. He was gone until nearly dark. Ethan and Clara waited. They didn't discuss it. Nay. They both worked Ethan on the equipment that needed attention before spring. Clara on the march, accounts, and the ranch house held the particular silence of 2 people not talking about the thing they were both thinking about, which was a different kind of silence than the one they'd started with, and somehow easier to be inside. Around 4 o'clock, Clara put coffee on. Ethan came in from the cold 10 minutes later, heard the pot, and sat down without being asked. He poured. She sat across from him. He went to see Aldridge, Ethan said. Yes, and probably Holloway, probably. Ethan turned his cup in his hands. If Holloway has prepared for this, he has, Clara said. He's been preparing since October. He's a man who prepares. She looked at her coffee. But there's a difference between preparing the stories and having the documents to support it. We have the documents. He has a story. Ethan was quiet. You really believe we'll win this, he said. Not a challenge. Something more like wonder. The tone of a man who had spent so long managing alone that the concept of we still arrived in his chest like something slightly foreign and slightly astonishing. I believe we've done everything that can be done, she said carefully. Whether that's enough depends on Garrett. She paused. But yes, I think it's enough. He looked at her across the table. Clara, she waited. When this is over, he stopped. Put the cup down. Tried again with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing footing. When Garrett goes back to Denver, and the inquiry closes, and Holloway either accepts the ruling or he doesn't, I want to talk to you about something. Her heart did something she didn't give it permission to do. All right, she said. Not now, he said, when it's over. When I can say it without it being tangled up in all of this. His jaw worked. I want to say it cleanly. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said again. They heard Garrett's horse in the yard. They both stood, and whatever Ethan had been building toward sat between them, patient and unspoken, like a letter sealed and not yet opened. Garrett came in and sat down and accepted the coffee. Clara poured without comment. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing what he intended to say. I spoke with Richard Aldridge, he said. Ethan said nothing. He's a careful man, Garrett continued. Careful about what he admits. Careful about how he frames things. He paused. But there's a particular kind of careful that tells you more than careless does. When a man is that precise about exactly which questions he'll answer directly, you learn to pay attention to which ones he won't. What didn't he answer directly? Clara said. Garrett looked at her. Whether he was retained by Holloway at the time he handled the 1882 inquiry. Kitchen was very still. He didn't deny it, Ethan said. He said he didn't recall the specific timing of his professional relationship with Mr. Holloway. Garrett's voice was flat, careful, which is a sentence that takes considerable preparation to say without answering. Clara set down her cup. "What does that mean for the inquiry?" she said. "It means," Garrett said, "that I have sufficient grounds to recommend the 1,882 closure be invalidated, and the original boundary survey be confirmed as the authoritative document." He paused. "It also means I'll be filing a separate report with the federal office regarding the conduct of the Cheyenne agent who handled the original inquiry." Ethan looked at him steadily. "And Holloway's counter-survey?" "Curtis Fenn's report contradicts the purpose it was filed to serve," Garrett said. "Counter-survey that confirms the original survey is not a counter-survey. It's corroboration." He paused again, looked at both of them. "Your title to the north boundary is sound, Mr. Calloway. My recommendation will say so." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Ethan sat very still. Clara looked at the table. She was not a woman who cried easily or publicly, and she did not cry now. But something in her chest released something she hadn't fully known she'd been holding. And the release of it was physical, a loosening of something that had been wound tight since the day she'd found that letter behind the deed. "Thank you," Ethan said. The two words he said when the larger thing was too big. Garrett nodded once. "Recommendations aren't final rulings," he said. "There's a process. Holloway can appeal. It could take months." "But the recommendation stands," Clara said. "The recommendation stands." She nodded. Garrett finished his coffee and went to his room, because he was a man who understood when a conversation was over and when two people needed the room. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back at him. And for a moment neither of them said anything. There was too much to say, and all of it was true, and some of it was the thing he'd said he wanted to say cleanly when it was over, and it was over now, or the first part of it was. And the word "we" was in the room between them, like something that had finally decided it was going to stay. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. She almost smiled. "You don't know what I was going to say?" "No," he said. "But whatever it was, I know." He looked at her steadily. "Is that strange?" "And no." He nodded. Then he stood, and he did something that was simple and enormous in the way of things that had been building for 3 months. He came around and he stood beside her chair, and he offered her his hand. Not to steady himself this time, just his hand, open. He offered. She took it. He held it for a moment that was brief and complete, and said everything the sealed letter had been holding. Then Tom knocked on the back door, about the Northface, and the moment ended the way moments did, practically and without apology, and they both went back to the work of running a ranch in Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1885. But she carried the weight of that held hand with her for the rest of the day. And she did not put it down. Holloway's response came 2 weeks later. Not in person this time. A letter, delivered through Aldridge, formal and cold, and written in the language of a man who had decided to fight through process rather than presence. He was appealing Garrett's recommendation. Filing with the federal office in Washington. Cite procedural irregularities in the investigation itself. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down. Clara read it. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a woman doing calculations she didn't entirely like the results of. "He has money and time," she said. "A federal appeal could take a year." "Longer. Yes. He doesn't have to win it," she said. "Not for the first time. He just has to keep it in dispute long enough to make this ranch difficult to operate." "I know." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" He looked at the letter. "No," he said honestly. He picked up his coffee. "But I'm not either." She studied him. Something in his face, the set of it, the particular steadiness, was different from November. Then, from the man who had stood outside his ranch house looking at frozen ground like a man reading his own grave marker. That man had been alone so long he'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. This man was not that man anymore. "We write back," she said. Not to Holloway, to the federal office in Washington. We document the appeal as retaliatory filed in direct response to a federal investigation into Holloway's conduct, not in good faith dispute of the boundary itself. She paused. And we contact the 6 families whose water access this affects. If Holloway controls the north boundary, he controls their water. They have standing in this appeal, and they don't know it. Ethan looked at her. You want to organize the valley, he said. I want to tell the other families what they're facing, she said. What they do with that is their business. He was quiet for a moment. That changes things, he said. It becomes bigger than us. It was always bigger than us, she said. We just didn't have standing to say so until now. He looked at her for a long time. Then, how do you want to approach them? Out together, she said immediately. Not you alone. Together. These families need to see that this ranch is stable. That we're not going to fold, she paused. A man alone looks like a man fighting for himself. A man with his wife looks like a man building something. Yeah. Something moved across his face, the thing that moved there when she said something that arrived differently than he was prepared for. Together, she said. He nodded. He said, tomorrow, she said. They rode to 5 ranches in 3 days, the Hendersons, whose south pasture bordered Holloway's water claim. Nanny. The Pratt family, who had homesteaded in the valley longer than anyone and remembered when Marcus Holloway had arrived as a young man with borrowed money and large ambitions. Old Samuel Gear, who ran sheep on the eastern rise and said almost nothing, until the end of the conversation when he said, with the economy of a man who had survived many winters, You tell me where to sign and I'll sign it. Each ranch, Clara spoke as much as Ethan did, sometimes more. She explained the legal situation, in clear language, without condescension, and without simplifying to the point of distortion. She told them what Holloway controlled, if he controlled the water. She told them what they could do about it. She watched their faces as she talked. Annie. She watched the women, especially who sat at the edges of these conversations with the particular watchfulness of people who understood that the outcome mattered to them as much as the husbands, but who were accustomed to not being addressed directly. Clara addressed them directly. At the Pratt Ranch, Sarah Pratt, 60 years old, sharp-eyed, with the hands of a woman who had worked land life her entire said to Clara, while their husbands were looking at documents. You're the one who found the Aldridge connection. Clara said. How I read everything, Clara said. Including the things that had been filed away like they didn't matter. Sarah Pratt looked at her for a moment. My husband filed a complaint about the water access 3 years ago, she said. County clerk said it wasn't actionable. Do you still have the paperwork? I kept everything. Clara looked at her steadily. Mrs. Pratt, if your filing can be attached to our federal complaint as an additional instance of the same pattern, it strengthens the entire case. Stood up. I'll get the box, she said. Ethan, who had caught the end of this exchange, looked at Clara as Sarah Pratt left the room. You knew she'd have something, he said quietly. I hoped, Clara said. Not much of one. You knew to ask. She met his eyes. I know what it looks like when a woman has been keeping records because she knew someday they'd matter and nobody else was going to keep them. A pause. I've been doing it my whole life. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since February, not the assessing look of November, not the recalculating look of December, but something that had no agenda in it. Something that was just him, seeing her, without the distance he'd maintained for 11 years. I know, he said quietly. 2 words, the same weight they always carried when he meant them. The 5th ranch visit was the one that changed the shape of everything. The McAllister place sat on the northwest corner of the valley, close enough to the water source that James McAllister had been in quiet dispute with Holloway about access rights for 6 years. He was a large, deliberate man in his 50s who had listened to everything Ethan and Clara had to say with his arms crossed and his face giving nothing away. They finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said Holloway bought the McCready claim last fall. Ethan went still. What quiet transaction? Nobody announced it. McAllister looked at his table. McCready's land borders the Federal Water Survey point on the north side. If Holloway owns that parcel, he doesn't just have a claim on the water access. He has a legal pathway to argue it's already his. Clara's mind moved fast through the implications. The Federal Survey point, she said. Is it documented in the original territorial survey? Supposed to be. Then it's protected under territorial law, regardless of adjacent property ownership. She looked at Ethan. But if Holloway is trying to argue control through the McCready purchase, he's building a second case, Ethan said, separate from the boundary dispute. One that doesn't depend on the 1882 inquiry at all. They looked at each other. He planned this, Clara said. Me. Not with surprise. With the specific feeling of a chess player who has just seen 3 moves ahead and understood that the opponent was playing a longer game than they'd accounted for. He bought McCready's land before your telegram, McAllister said. Before the blizzard, before any of this. He looked at them both. Been building toward this for years. You two just made him move faster. Was very quiet. Then Clara said, does the Federal Survey documentation include the water source point boundaries? Don't know, McAllister said. Garrett would know, Ethan said. Then we need to contact Garrett before the Washington appeal is decided, Clara said. Me. If the source is documented in the Federal Survey, the McCready purchase doesn't give Holloway what he thinks it gives him. And Garrett's report needs to address it. McAllister unfolded his arms. What do you need from me? A statement, Clara said. Documenting when you first learned of the McCready transaction and what Holloway said to you about water access in the last 2 years. I got 6 years of those conversations, McAllister said. A ledger. Clara looked at him. He almost smiled. My wife kept it, said someday we'd need it. I told her she was worrying for nothing. He stood. I'll tell her she was right. She'll appreciate hearing it. He went to the ledger. Ethan leaned close to Clara and said, "Lo, a ledger." Ain, women who are paying attention. Aiden, she said, equally low. Neen always keep records. A. He looked at her sideways with the almost smile she'd been watching come further out of him for 3 months. Is that what you've been doing? Paying attention? It's the first day, she said. And what have you concluded? She met his eyes. That I was right to come, she said quietly. Everything. He held her gaze for a long moment. Clara. McCallan came back with the ledger, and the moment folded itself away into the business of the afternoon. But Ethan's unfinished sentence sat in the space between them for the whole ride home, warm and present and patient as the man himself. The letter to Garrett went out the next morning. It included McAllister's statement, Sarah Pratt's 3-year-old filing, documentation of the McCready land transaction, and Clara's legal analysis of how the Federal Water Survey point interacted with adjacent private property claims under territorial law. She was up until 2 in the morning writing it. Ethan stayed up with her. He didn't write that was her work, and he understood that, but he kept the fire, kept the coffee. When she read sections back to him and asked if the logic was clear, he told her honestly when it was, and honestly when it wasn't. Around midnight he said, "You should sleep, not yet." Clara, Ethan. She looked up from the papers. I slept for 27 years while things happened to me. I am done sleeping while things can be done. He was quiet. Then that's the most I've ever heard you say about what your life was like before you came here. She looked at him for a moment. The lamp between them, the late hour, the paper surrounding them, all of it conspiring toward honesty the way the 2 in the morning had conspired toward honesty the night of the blizzard. It wasn't a bad life, she said carefully. It was just a life where I was always the person who managed things for other people and was not invited to have things of my own. She looked at the letter. A father who needed managing. A town that needed me to be what they expected. A future that was going to be more of the same. She paused. I answered your telegram because it was the first offer I'd ever received that was honest about what it was. No pretense of romance, no promises, just a ranch that needed running. A term I could evaluate. She looked up. I could evaluate terms. I couldn't evaluate promises. Ethan was very still. And now, he said. She looked at him across the lamplight. Now, she said slowly, I am in a situation I could not have evaluated in November because I did not have sufficient information. A pause. I have more information now. Something moved across his face. And she held his gaze. And she said, I find that I am no longer interested in leaving. The word leaving. She had not realized until she said it that it had been a live question in her mind since she arrived an exit she'd kept visible, the way you kept an exit visible when you didn't know if you were safe. A door she'd been standing near while she worked, just in case. And at some point she couldn't name exactly when. Maybe the fence line in the blizzard. Maybe the cribbage table. Maybe $64.30. Maybe a held hand on a February porch. She had walked away from that door. She hadn't noticed, but she had. Ethan looked at her for a long time. Good, he said. The single word of a man who had said the only thing that was worth saying. She went back to the letter. He kept the fire. And the ranch was quiet around them, the way a good place was quiet. With the particular piece of walls that held and land, that was worth fighting for, and two people who had found each other inside an arrangement they'd both survived into something larger than either of them had planned. Garrett's response arrived, 11 days later. He had incorporated the McAllister statement and the Pratt filing. He had confirmed that the Federal Water Survey point was documented in the original 1,868 territorial survey and was therefore protected under federal land authority regardless of adjacent property ownership. The McCready purchase gave Holloway a shared border. It did not give him the water. His amended recommendation went to Washington with a supplementary report on the pattern of conduct he'd identified the 1,882 inquiry. The counter-survey, the McCready purchase, Aldridge's conflict of interest. It was thorough. It was the work of a man who Clara suspected had seen enough of Marcus Holloway's kind to be tired of them. Billy read the letter in the yard and let out a sound that was not quite a word. Tom took off his hat and said nothing, which was how Tom expressed his deepest feelings. Ethan read it, standing at the kitchen table. He set it down. Looked at Clara. She had already read it over his shoulder and was standing very still with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression on her face that was not triumph. She didn't trust triumph, had never trusted it. Had grown up in circumstances that taught you the difference between winning and having won, but was something adjacent to relief, so profound it was almost grief. It's not final, she said. No, he said, he can still appeal to Washington. Could still take months, Clara. His voice was quiet. Stop, she looked at him. Stop managing the outcome, he said. Just for a minute, let it be what it is. She looked at him. Was right. She knew he was right. She let herself feel it, the full weight of what they had done together since November. The blizzard and the fence, and the ledgers and the lawyers and 5 ranch visits and a letter written by lamplight until 2 in the morning. She let herself feel all of it at once. It was a great deal. Right, she said. For a minute. I watched her do it, watched her let herself have it. Then he said, there's something I've been meaning to say to you. She looked at him. I told you I wanted to say it cleanly, he said. It was over. Or not over, but settled enough. He put both hands on the table the way he did when something cost him something. I'm not a man who says things easily. You know that. I know, she said. And I'm not going to pretend I handled the beginning of this well. I handled it badly. I chose you for the wrong reasons, and I treated the arrangement like a transaction, when you were a person who deserved better than a transaction. He held her gaze. I want you to know I understand that, not as an apology that closes the account. As something I intend to keep understanding. She was very still. Ethan, let me finish. He took a breath. I have spent 3 months watching you do extraordinary things as though they were ordinary. Watching you hold your ground when men tried to make you feel small. Watching you think 10 steps ahead of everyone else and never once ask for credit for it. He paused. And I have been trying for 3 months to find the right word for what I feel about that. His jaw worked. I think the word is love, Clara. I think it's been that for a while. And I should have found the courage to say it before now. Kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him across the table. This man, who had burned ancient kitchen sinks before she arrived and decided in advance that nothing would change. Who had carried 11 years of alone like a coat he'd forgotten he was wearing. Who had said thank you in a voice that cost something every time he'd said it. Who had held her hand in a January morning and a February afternoon and meant it both times in ways that didn't need translation. Took me a while too, she said quietly, to find the word. Did you find it? Yes, she said. And she held his gaze across everything they'd built together in 3 months, the ledgers and the letters and the hard cold fence work, and 5 ranch families and a federal inquiry, and the particular and unrepeatable thing that happened when two people found each other not through romance but through trust, through the bone-deep evidence of showing up when it mattered. And it's the same word, she said. He came around the table. He stood in front of her. He put both hands on her face, careful and certain, the way a man touched something he understood the value of. And he kissed her, not tentatively, not with the performance of a first kiss. With the sureness of a man who had been certain of something for a while and was done waiting for the right moment because the right moment was now and now was what they had. She put her hands on his chest, felt his heart under her palms. Nettie, sure, entirely present. When they broke apart, she looked at him. He looked back. Behind them, through the kitchen window, the Wyoming afternoon was doing what Wyoming afternoons did in late February, cold and clear and vast and entirely indifferent to the specific human things happening inside the ranch house. But inside the ranch house, something was no longer in question. Nina. Something that had been building since a telegram and a trunk and a wagon ride, and $64.30 had finally arrived at the only destination it had ever been heading toward. Not the end of something, the beginning of what it actually was. And Clara Whitmore, who had come to this territory with one trunk and no promises and a heart she'd decided to keep very still, felt that heart open. Without managing it, without evaluating the terms. Without keeping one eye on the door. For the first time in her life, entirely without reservation. And that, she thought, was the most extraordinary thing that had happened in 3 months of extraordinary things. Not the federal inquiry, not the boundary ruling, not the Valley families and the ledger, and the letter written by lamplight. Just this. Holloway filed his Washington appeal on a Thursday in March. Billy brought the news from town with the particular expression of a young man who had learned over 4 months that bad news delivered fast was better than bad news delivered gently. He said it straight. Holloway had engaged a Washington attorney. The appeal cited procedural overreach in Garrett's amended recommendation. It, named Clara, specifically referred to her, in the formal legal language of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, as an unqualified party whose interference in a federal land matter had compromised the integrity of the investigation. Ethan read the relevant section twice. Then he set the document down on the kitchen table and looked at it the way he looked at things he was deciding how to handle. Clara read it standing beside him. She finished, stepped back. Crossed her arms. He named you, Ethan said. His voice was quiet and had something in it she hadn't heard before. Something that ran under the words like a current under ice. He named me, she confirmed. He's trying to discredit the complaint by discrediting you. She uncrossed her arms, picked up the document again. Read the specific paragraph one more time. An unqualified party with no professional standing in matters of federal land survey, operating outside the bounds of her domestic role. She set it down. He's not wrong that I have no professional standing. Entirely wrong about everything else. She looked at him. His jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was managing something considerable, and had decided to manage it quietly. Ethan, she said. This is a legal strategy. He's trying to create a procedural argument that removes the foundation of our complaint. If the complaint is considered compromised by my involvement. It isn't. It might be framed that way. She kept her voice steady. We need to think about this carefully, not react. He looked at her. He called you unqualified, he said. In a federal document, I know. He said domestic role. I know, Clara. He put both hands flat on the table. The same posture he used when something was costing him enough that he had to anchor himself. I spent 3 months watching you do the work that saved this ranch. And I am not going to stand here and discuss how to be careful about a man who just put that work in a legal document and called it domestic. Looked at him for a long moment. What do you want to do? She said. I want to write back, he said. Not through lawyers. Not through process. I want to take him into the federal office in Washington in my name, documenting exactly what you did and exactly what it accomplished, and exactly what this ranch and this valley would have lost without it. He paused. I want every family we visited to do the same. That's not legal strategy, she said. No, he said, it's the truth. Sometimes the truth is the only strategy that works. She looked at him across the table. This man who had eaten alone for 11 years because he'd decided trust was a wound waiting to happen, had burned a telegram in a kitchen fire, and decided in advance that nothing would change. Who had changed anyway. Not because she'd made him. Because he'd chosen to, one careful, costly choice at a time. All right, she said, write it. He sat down and wrote it that afternoon. 4 pages. She read it when he finished and did not change a single word, because it was exactly what it needed to be, direct and specific and completely without decoration, the way Ethan Calloway said everything that mattered. Billy rode it to town before dark. Ailey responded in a way that Clara had not entirely allowed herself to expect. James McAllister's statement arrived within 3 days. 2 pages, clear as creek water, every specific instance of water access dispute documented with the precision of a man whose wife had kept a ledger for 6 years. Sarah Pratt wrote 4 pages. She wrote them herself, not through her husband, and she wrote them in the voice of a woman who had been watching Marcus Holloway operate in this valley for 20 years, and was done watching. Old Samuel Gear sent 1 page, 11 sentences, each one doing exactly the work it needed to do and nothing else. Nay. The Henderson family sent a letter signed by both James and Margaret Henderson together, which was unusual enough in 1885 that Clara thought the federal office would notice it. And Curtis Fenn wrote. That was the one Clara hadn't expected. Curtis Fenn, the surveyor who had spent 2 days sitting with the choice between an honest report and an easy one, wrote a 4-page statement to the Washington federal office, documenting the specific instructions he had received from Holloway's representative, what those instructions had asked him to say, what the markers had actually shown, and why he had written the report he wrote instead of the one he'd been paid to write. He attached his professional credentials, 15 years of surveys across Wyoming territory. Not a single one disputed. Clara read his letter sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and felt something move through her that she couldn't immediately name. Ethan came in and she handed it to him, without speaking. He read it, set it down, looked at her. His wife came here, he said. Yes, she did that, he said. Eleanor Fenn rode out here and talked to you and went home, and her husband wrote this letter. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief. In the way of a man encountering something that expanded his understanding of what people were capable of when they chose to be honest. We need to acknowledge it, Clara said. Write to them. Not officially, personally. Yes, he said immediately. She wrote the letter to the Fenns that afternoon, 1 page. Simple and direct and true. She thanked Eleanor by name for coming. She thanked Curtis by name for his courage. She said that what they had done would matter beyond this case, in ways they might not see, but that were real nonetheless. She signed it, Clara and Ethan Calloway, Calloway Ranch. The first time she had written her name that way, she didn't mention it. But Ethan was watching when she wrote it, and she felt him see it, and neither of them said anything, and it was the right way to handle it. The Washington ruling came 6 weeks later. Not by Billy. by a federal courier who rode directly to the ranch, a formality that told Clara something before she opened the envelope, because the federal office did not send couriers to deliver bad news. She was alone when he arrived. Ethan was at the north pasture. Tom was with him. She signed for the envelope, thanked the courier, gave him coffee and water for his horse, and waited until he'd gone before she sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. He read it once, read it again. Then she set it flat on the table and put both hands over it, not covering it, just touching it. The way you touched something you wanted to be sure was real. Appeal was denied. Garrett's amended recommendation was upheld in full. The 1882 inquiry closure was invalidated. The original boundary survey was confirmed as the authoritative document. The Federal Water Survey Point was protected under the 1868 Territorial Survey, specifically excluding adjacent private property claims from water access rights. At the bottom of the ruling, in the specific language of federal findings, notation that Clara read 3 times. A. The federal office acknowledges the documented pattern of conduct by interested parties in this matter and has referred the relevant evidence to the appropriate oversight bodies for further review. Aldridge, the Cheyenne agent. Holloway's long pattern of using legal process as a weapon. Persecuted, not prosecuted, maybe never. Seen, documented, named. She was still sitting with her hands on the ruling when she heard Ethan's boots on the porch. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her face. "Yeah, Clara." She looked up. She could see him reading her expression the way he'd learned to read it, the specific quality of her stillness when something had happened that was too large for her ordinary composure to contain it. "Tell me," he said. She slid the ruling across the table. He came to the table. Read it standing, the way he read things that mattered. She watched his face do its complicated work at the controlled exterior, managing what was underneath, and underneath it something she had learned to see clearly after 5 months. Relief so profound it was almost grief. He set the document down. He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down heavily in the chair across from her and put his face in his hands and breathed. Just breathed. The specifics of a man releasing something he had been carrying for a very long time, not just since November, but longer. Since the first offer Holloway had made, since the boundary question had appeared in 1882. Since a father had built 40 acres into 400, and left a son with everything except the certainty that it would hold. Uclear did not say anything. She put her hand on the table between them, not quite reaching him. Available. He reached out and took it, held it. She let him have the silence he needed. After a while he lifted his face. His eyes were dry. He was not a man who cried, and this was not that. But something had passed through him and left him different on the other side, the way weather passed through a place and left it clean. "Done," he said. "The formal part," she said. "Holloway may still make things difficult in smaller ways. He's not a man who, Clara." His voice was steady and quiet and entirely certain. "It's done." She looked at him. He was right. She let it be done. "Yes," she said. He squeezed her hand once. "Anne." Then he stood, and he went to the window, and he looked out at the north land, the land that was his, that had always been his. At a boundary survey from 1860, and an honest surveyor, and a federal agent from Denver, and 5 Valley families, and 1 woman with a ledger eye and a letter-writing hand, had confirmed and protected, and would continue to protect. "I want to do something," he said. "What?" He turned from the window. "I want to ride the north boundary line. With you." He paused. "I've been riding it alone since my father died. I want to ride it with someone who—" He stopped, found the word. "Who knows what it cost?" She stood. "Give me 5 minutes to get my coat," she said. Rode the north boundary line in the March afternoon. Just the 2 of them, the land still cold, but with the particular quality that Wyoming land had in late winter when the season was beginning its long turn toward something warmer. Ethan rode it the way he knew it, every post, every marker, every place where the fence bent around a rise or a rocky outcrop. He named things as they passed them. Not for her benefit specifically, but in the way of a man walking through his own memory and choosing to share it for the first time. The oak post his father had set in 1861, the place where the fence had been repaired 17 times and now ran truer than the original. North marker, the iron cap she'd photographed in January, worn but legible, entirely clear about where the Calloway land ended and the rest of the world began. Rhodes abide him and listened, and let him give her the history of this place, the same way she'd given him the history of herself, not all at once, not as a presentation, but piece by piece as trust allowed. At the north marker he stopped. She stopped beside him. They looked at it in silence for a moment. "My father set this one himself," he said. Said he wanted to know exactly where his land ended. And a man who didn't know his own edges didn't really know himself. Clara looked at the marker. "He was right," she said. Ethan looked at her. "He would have liked you." She turned to look at him. "He valued people who did what needed doing," he said. Being asked, without waiting to be credited for it, he held her gaze. "He would have recognized you immediately." She felt something pull in her chest. "I would have liked to know him," she said. He nodded. They sat with that for a moment, the particular tenderness of two people meeting in the space between the living and the gone. People did when they had started building a life together and realized the building included everything that came before. And Ethan said, "I need to ask you something." She waited. "I asked you in November if you'd come here and be my wife." He kept his eyes on the marker. "I asked it in a telegram. 7 words. I did not ask it well." "I want to ask it again." Clara went very still. He turned to look at her. "On horseback anymore, as 2 ranchers surveying land." "Yeah. Something else. Something that had been building since the kitchen table and the cribbage game and the blizzard fence and $64.30. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the ranch needs running. Me. Not because the arrangement made sense. Because you are the person I want beside me, and I should have known how to say that months ago, and I'm saying it now." He held her gaze absolutely steady. "Will you stay, Clara? Not as an arrangement. As my wife." Actually and truly. The north marker stood between them and the rest of the world. Wyoming sky was doing what Wyoming sky did in March, enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to the human things happening under it. Edgar Whitmore across from her on horseback in the winter afternoon, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely certain. Not careful certain, not evaluating the term certain. Certain the way you were certain of things that did not require evidence, because you had been living inside the evidence for 5 months, and it had been consistent every single day. She said, "Absolute," the only word that fit. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. Cold air around them, the iron marker beside them. His land, their land running out in every direction, to the edges he now knew, and she now knew, and they both now knew together. He held her hand, she held his, and nothing else needed to be said. News reached Bitter Creek before they got back to the ranch. Tom had told Billy, who had told someone at the feed store while picking up supplies, who had told someone else. And by the time Ethan and Clara rode into the main yard in the late afternoon, the word federal ruling and Calloway and Holloway appeal denied had moved through the town with the particular speed of information that people had been waiting to hear. It arrived at the ranch house in the form of James McAllister, who came before supper with his wife Ellen and said almost nothing but shook Ethan's hand for a long time and then turned to Clara and said, "My wife wants to say something." Ellen McAllister was a small, quiet woman who had the eyes of someone who noticed everything and the posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She looked at Clara and said, "I want you to know that I have been in this valley for 22 years. And this is the first time anyone has explained to us what our legal rights were." In plain down. She paused. "You did that." Clara looked at her. "We all did it together," she said. Ellen McAllister shook her head slightly. "You started it," she said. "That matters." She said it with the particular conviction of a woman who understood exactly how rare it was for something to start. The Pratt family came the following day. Sarah Pratt brought food the specific language of a frontier woman, expressing things that didn't fit easily into words, and sat at Clara's kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about the valley, about the families who'd left, because the pressure had become too much, about the ones who'd stayed and the cost of staying. "It won't be over," Sarah said near the end of the visit. "Men like Holloway find other angles." "I know," Clara said. "But this." Sarah gestured at the kitchen, at the ranch, at the general direction of the north boundary line. "This makes it harder for him. Every time he tries something, he's got a documented history working against him now." She looked at Clara directly. "You built that. The federal record." A pause. "B. You understood that the most powerful thing wasn't beating him this time. It was making sure there was a record for next time." Looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." Jay nodded as though she'd confirmed something she'd suspected. "Nah, you're going to be all right out here," she said. "Both of you." It was the most straightforward endorsement Clara had ever received, and it settled in her chest with the particular warmth of recognition from a woman who did not give it easily. The hardest conversation happened the week after the ruling. Not hard because it was hostile. Hard in the way of conversations that mattered enough to require care. Ethan came in one evening and sat down at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, the posture she'd learned to read as the one he wore, when something was costing him the effort of finding words, and said, "I want to talk about the ranch." She sat down. "I've been thinking about the structure," he said. "The legal structure, how things are held." He turned the hat in his hands. "You die, Ethan. Let me say it," he said. Not sharply, just firmly. "When I die as things stand, the ranch goes to my nearest male relative. Ob's brother in Rollins." He paused. "I want to change that." She was very still. "I want to add your name to the deed," he said. "Equal ownership. Now. Not as a provision for after I'm gone, as a fact of how we hold this place starting today." He looked at her directly. "Me, you have earned that. You have more than earned that. And I should have thought of it sooner." Clara looked at him. Man who had sent a 7-word telegram and burned it the same morning. He had eaten alone at this table for 11 years. Who had built walls so high that a woman named Dora Fitch had called him cold as January granite and left. Let her in. Not because he'd had to, because he'd chosen to. One careful, costly choice at a time. "That's a significant thing," she said. "Yes, half ownership of this ranch, Ethan." She held his gaze. "I didn't come here for the land." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why you should have it." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He put his hat on the table and reached into his coat and produced a document she had not known he'd already had drawn up. And she understood from the date on it that he had gone to the county clerk's office 3 days ago and begun the process without telling her, because he had already decided and had not wanted the discussion to be about whether he was certain. He was certain. She took the document. She read it. She signed it. He signed it beside her. And Callaway Ranch became, legally and officially and permanently, something that belonged to both of them equally. The way it had functionally belonged to both of them. Since the night they'd sat at this table, until midnight going through the wrong column, and found $64.30 missing. Tom witnessed it. He did not say anything, but his face when he handed back the pen had the expression of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and had finally seen it arrive. Marcus Holloway came one final time. It was April. The land was beginning its turn, still cold, but with the particular quality of cold that was loosening its grip, the kind of cold that knew it was losing. Aim alone. That was the first difference. No men behind him. No lawyer, no performance of power. Rode into the yard on the gray horse and dismounted and stood there, and Ethan came out of the stable, and Clara came out of the house, and the three of them stood in the yard in the April morning and looked at each other. Holloway looked older than he had in February. Not dramatically. The specific way a man aged when something he'd been certain of had been removed from his certainty. He looked at Ethan first. "The Washington ruling stands," he said. "Yes," Ethan said. "I'm not appealing further." He said it without embellishment. The statement of a man who had done his accounting and arrived at a number he didn't like, but recognized as final. Ethan nodded. Holloway turned to look at Clara. She held his gaze. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man choosing how to handle something that had not gone the way he'd planned, which was, yes, she suspected, not a feeling he had much experience with. "You're a careful woman, Mrs. Calloway," he said finally. "I try to be," she said. "You understood what the documentation meant. What the federal record meant." He paused. "Most people don't think that far ahead." "Most people haven't needed to," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He said something she had not expected. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Before I started pressing on the water rights question. She would have told me to stop." He paused. "She told me to stop a lot of things." The yard was very quiet. Clara looked at him. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't explaining himself. He was simply, she thought, saying a true thing in the presence of people who had demonstrated they could handle true things. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded once. "Water access," he said, turning back to Ethan. "I want to propose a legitimate easement agreement. Access, documented, fair terms for both sides." He paused. "I have land that needs that water the same as anyone. I'd rather have a legal easement than a federal dispute." Ethan looked at him steadily. "Send the terms through a lawyer," he said. "Not Aldridge." Holloway's mouth moved. "Aldridge retired last month." "Then send them through whoever you use now," Ethan said. "We'll review them." Holloway nodded. He mounted. He looked at Clara one final time from the horse. "The families in this valley are going to remember what you did," he said. Yeah, for a long time she didn't answer that, because it wasn't something she'd done for memory. She'd done it because it needed doing. Yeah. Because the alternative was watching things happen to people who didn't know they had options, and she had sworn to herself, at 12 years old standing in an empty farmhouse, that she would never be that person who watched when she could act. Holloway rode out. Tom appeared from the stable. Billy appeared from around the corner of the bunkhouse. They both looked at Ethan and Clara, standing in the yard, watching Holloway's gray horse disappear down the road. "Well, Tom said," Ethan said. "Tom went back to work." Billy started to say something, caught Ethan's expression, and decided against it. Ethan looked at Clara. "A legitimate easement," he said. "If the terms are fair, then we take it," she said. "The other families benefit from a documented water agreement as much as we do." She paused. "Maybe more." He nodded. "You're already thinking about the next thing," he said. "I'm always thinking about the next thing." "I know." He said it with the almost smile that had become, in 5 months, one of her favorite things on earth. "It used to unsettle me. And now?" He looked at her with the expression that was not the assessing look of November, not the recalculating look of December, not even the open look of February. Something past all of those, something that had arrived at its destination and knew it. "Now," he said, "it's the most settling thing I know." She looked at him. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back, with the same deliberateness. He brought to everything careful, certain, entirely intentional. "Come inside," she said. "The accounts won't do themselves." "They'd be lost without you," he said. "They were lost without me," she said. $64.30 worth of lost. Laughed. A real laugh. Nay, full and unguarded. The way he laughed now, the way he'd been laughing since February, since the walls had come down enough for the sound to get out. She had decided that sound was one of the best things she'd ever earned. They went inside. Years later, people in the valley still talked about the winter of 1885. Not because of the blizzard, though the blizzard had been the worst in living memory, and there were still markers on ranch houses showing the waterline of the drifts. Not because of Marcus Holloway's failed land grab, though that story had made its way to Cheyenne and back, and had contributed to a federal review that changed how land inquiries were handled across 3 territories. They talked about it because of what came out of it. 5 families who had spent years not knowing they had legal standing, now with their rights documented in federal record. A water easement that was fair and clear and held for the next 40 years without dispute. A valley that had learned, in one hard winter, that it could act collectively when it needed to. 80. Because someone had thought to ask each family what they knew and had listened when they answered. And they talked about a woman who had arrived in November with one trunk and changed everything by March. Not by being exceptional in the way people meant when they used that word, to describe someone who was better than ordinary, but by being exceptional in the way that actually mattered, by doing the work that needed doing, by keeping records when everyone else forgot to. Understanding that right was never obvious without documentation, and that the people who benefited from confusion were always the ones with the most to gain from it. Clara Calloway, who had reorganized a larder and found a barrel seam and fixed 11 years of bad accounting and drafted a federal complaint and held her ground on a porch with 4 men in the yard and ridden a north boundary line in April and signed her name on a deed beside a man who had finally, after a long time alone, understood that alone was a choice he'd made rather than a condition of his nature. Ethan Calloway, who had burned a telegram in a kitchen fire and been wrong about almost everything, and had the particular and uncommon quality of being willing to know it. Tom retired from the Calloway Ranch in 1897 and said at his going-away supper, which Clara organized, and Ethan attended with the easy presence of a man who no longer ate at a separate table from anyone. The best thing he'd witnessed in 30 years of ranch work was not a cattle drive or a land dispute or a Wyoming winter. Nay, it was a woman sitting down at a kitchen table with a ledger in November 1885 and saying sit down to a man who needed to hear it. And the man sitting down. Everything else, Tom said, followed from that. He was right. It had. From the first cold morning of a hard winter to the April afternoon when a gray horse disappeared down a ranch road, for the last time, every piece of it had followed from 2 people choosing one careful, costly choice at a time to trust something they hadn't planned on and couldn't have predicted, and wouldn't in the end have traded for anything the world had on offer. Not the ruling, not the $64.30. Each other, just each other, that was the whole of it. And it was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything.